Hi, welcome to Glass Manifesto. My name is Peter Bowles. We're going to talk today a little bit about the art and the science of glass making. So we'll start through here in the workshop. The heart of any glass making studio is the glass melting furnace. We have a electric melting furnace here at Glass Manifesto. It's a very special piece of equipment, and this is where we actually transform all the raw materials of glass into the material that we use as part of our glass blowing process. So this is the furnace. It has a large ceramic crucible that sits inside the furnace, runs 24 hours, 7 days a week, and as I say, this is very much the heart of the whole of the operation. So in here, this runs at about 1100 degrees throughout the working day. We have various reheating chambers, reheating furnaces, and we switch these on and off daily, depending on the size and the type of work that we're making. And you'll see a little bit more about how these are used later in the video. But these get up to similar temperatures, maybe a little hotter than the furnace, around 1100 degrees, 1150 degrees centigrade. Over here we have a range of electric kilns, and these are used for warming coloured glass up in a very controlled way, and then actually cooling the finished pieces of work that we make down again in a very controlled way, all through very specific temperature controlled ranges. So in this little box here, at around 600 degrees, this is where we warm our coloured glass up, and so we'll be using these pieces later in the making. And then this kiln here at about 500 degrees, where we put all the finished pieces in throughout the day, and then at the end of the day this will get cooled down to room temperature. From anything between 48 and 36 hours is the cooling process. So because we only ever melt clear glass in the furnace, all of the coloured glass we apply to the work as we're making each individual piece. The coloured glass comes to us as ready-made rods and chips and powders, and these come in a whole palette of both transparent colours and opaque colours. So all of these colours are mixable, blendable, layerable, they're all interchangeable, and through having a palette of maybe over 120 colours, we can extend that palette into a whole array of varying tonality and sort of colour complexity. Different colour glasses are made using various metal oxides or metal carbonates that are added to a base clear glass. So copper will give us very beautiful aquamarines and turquoises. Cobalt oxide will give us a very strong and rich blue. Manganeses will give us browns or purples. And then we have more complex colours with silvers and golds that can give us very beautiful ruby and purple colouring. This is what we call filling the furnace. This is the process where we're loading what we call the glass batch, which is a mixture of Tasmanian silica sands, lime, potash, various other chemical ingredients, as a very special recipe that gets loaded incrementally into the furnace. Takes about between 14 and 16 hours to incrementally fill the pot. And then once the pot's full, we actually start to do the whole melting process and the refining process. So what we have here is the last melt going into the furnace, and this is a little bit of an insight into what's really happening in this transitional phase of all these ingredients and how they transition into glass. So quite often we talk about melting glass from its raw materials. What we're actually really doing is creating an environment very alkalinic. So the soda within the mix creates a very alkalinic environment which actually dissolves the silica in this process. What we're doing here is actually stirring the glass, mechanically stirring the glass, and this is all about creating as much homogeneity within the matrix of the glass. So we're stirring it, making sure everything is thoroughly mixed, and we have an even distribution of all of those raw elements within the mix. And this makes sure that the clear glass that we have has no deviations or no lines of altering optical density. So this is us drawing the first clear glass from the furnace. We're going to be drawing this out into what we call cane or stringers. Is all about the malleability of this material in its ability to stretch out into these very long, evenly thicknessed lengths of clear glass. And then once cooled, easily cut. And so this is where it gets quite interesting. We're actually dealing with two chemically reactive coloured glasses here. This piece I have here is a copper-based glass, and Anne's preparing a silver-based glass that we're going to very evenly fold over the top. So we're building up layers of coloured glass here. Okay, this time. And again, now that these glasses are layered, we're using the malleability to stretch this out into fine cane. So these canes are the basis of quite a lot of the pattern making processes that we use. We're now cutting these to very specific lengths. We are cognizant of the density of the colours, but also the proportions of the colours within each cane. And it's a very critical part of the pattern making process. So these have to be cleaned and then placed into this aluminium mould and now preheated again, so the glass will actually stick to the next layer of glass. This is Anne picking up what will become the inner core of the piece. So it's been preheated in a kiln to about 600 degrees centigrade, and now she's transferring it to the melting furnace, just making sure everything's clean. And then this will be brought from a solid all the way through to being quite a fluid, soft material. So Anne's managing the heat, shaping the glass, and getting it into a particular shape and form that we can use to now fold over this clear glass I have on the end of the blowing iron. So I'm pushing the colour glass over. This becomes a fairly fine layer of colour glass as the inner core and the background colour for the rest of the colour glass that will be built up on the surface. So we're getting this into a particular shape now, and we're going to be picking up those prepared colour glass canes onto the outside. So this is the way that we get a very equal spacing. And now these canes get very gently merged and fused into the inner core of colour glass. So we're starting from the inside of the piece and building up layers towards the outside. This is the clear glass stringer. We pulled this one first, and this will be used to actually create the complexity within the pattern that we're making. So here, this is the colour glass canes getting fused, merging and melting into the surface. And now we'll actually start twisting these to start creating the pattern that we're looking for. So this is pushing the colour glass into the body. And now, by rotating the pipe in one direction on the Marva, we can actually start to twist these as evenly as we possibly can. And then once we're happy that they're twisted enough, we're getting this mass of glass nice and hot again. So we can pick up the clear glass. And so this is the clear glass just starting to get merged and pushed into that body. So we're actually pushing the clear glass through the coloured glass canes, and this is the pattern that starts to emerge. So we've got one set of canes being twisted one way, and then once the clear canes go on, the whole pattern gets twisted back the opposite direction. This is just tidying the pattern up from the bottom end. Okay, yes please. And so what Anne's doing here is preparing just a tiny little spot of colour glass just to tidy up the constricted canes at the bottom of that pattern. So she's using a very focused flame, just heating up a very tiny bit of clear coloured glass. Beautiful. Thank you. And just filling that gap. And so that's pretty much the pattern making process finished. We're just building heat back into that core making the glass malleable again, and this is where we can actually start inflating what has been until now a solid piece of glass, using a little bit of compressed air, blowing down the pipe, and this just pushes a bubble into that core of coloured and clear glass. It's a very subtle movement, and now just by hand trapping air into the pipe, and that will just expand and force that bubble a little bit larger into the piece. So what we do now is just letting this cool down. We're going to collect the first of two what we call gathers of clear glass from the furnace. So we're going to encase this pattern in clear glass. But before we do that, we actually have to let this cool down so we don't smudge or smear or mess the pattern up. And so this is dipping the iron into that pot of clear glass. It's around 1100 degrees centigrade. And so at this stage the glass really is quite malleable. It's very much sort of a honey consistency. But because it's built up around that solid core, it's a lovely part of the process, just managing now this layer of clear glass around that colour core. So using wet newspaper as a shaping tool here, and what actually happens is the heat of the glass is actually driving the moisture within that pad to steam, and then the glass basically just rides on a bed of steam. So there's not so much contact actually with the paper. It is this sort of, the glass is riding on a bed of steam. Right. Now Anne's blowing down the pipe, so whilst I'm shaping and cooling down the bubble in particular areas, Anne's starting to inflate that bubble.
So he places the air when I blow to where exactly he needs it to be inflated, but when he blows just then, he's inflating the whole thing. Yeah. When I blow, he's got the paper or the jacks on the piece and he's cooling it down, and so where he's got the paper is where it's colder, so that he's inflating it where he isn't.
So again, just letting this cool down. So the glass is still at around 600, 700 degrees centigrade, but it's only just moving under its own weight. So it's almost ready to take the next layer of clear glass. I'll have a quench, please. This is just cooling the pipe down, and then back to the bench to start shaping and evening out that mass of clear. So in order to keep the glass malleable, we're introducing it back into this furnace, keeping the iron turning, keeping the glass centered all the time. And this way we're keeping the glass malleable and workable.
Yeah, and a little blow, please.
And so we can start shaping and controlling the glass. Again, Anne's going to start inflating this whilst I'm shaping. So what we're really doing when we're blowing glass is managing the malleability. Glass as a material at about 1200 degrees is a very honey sort of consistency, all the way down to 600 degrees where the glass is pretty much rigid and solid. But all through that 600 degree range the glass becomes softer and softer the hotter and hotter it gets. And the actual blowing process is all about managing the viscosity of the glass. Sometimes we're heating the whole piece, sometimes we're heating very specific parts of it, just depending on what part of that process is. But the whole process is understanding and managing the malleability of that glass. And so here we're starting to create a constriction around the top of the piece. This is what we call the jack line or the neckline. And this is a very traditional way of making blown glass vessels. Can't stop moving once we start. It's the whole thing is about keeping this glass centered. If we were to stop moving, the glass will just drip and run to the floor. So this is a special torch that we use for very focused, very localized heat. So what we're doing here is actually letting most of the glass get cold whilst we're heating up a very specific area. And this is a really useful tool to give us very precise, very focused heat, so we can actually shape very particular parts of the glass without getting the whole piece hot. This is a relatively new addition to the glass making tool. And so there we can actually flatten the base very accurately using that very focused heat. The glass, shape it, and then we're going to stick these two things together. So Anne's just starting to prepare a second pipe. We're going to be transferring this piece onto a second iron so we can start to work the piece from the top. So she's taking glass from the furnace, she gives it a particular shape, waits for it to be at a very particular temperature, at around 800 degrees, and then we'll actually be joining Anne's pipe to this prepared flattened pad on the bottom of the piece. And so we're just using the fusibility of glass here, so it's just tack fused as a temporary join onto the bottom, and that restriction that we put in the top is now made as very weak points. So I'm just going to pull this up onto the rail.
Yeah.
And then a gentle tap,
Take it from me.
and the piece gets transferred onto the iron. And so now we have a hole at the top that we can now start working to finish the form. So this is a very beautiful tool called a Sophietta, and this is used as our last opportunity to actually inflate the piece whilst it's on the, now that it's on the, what we call the punty iron. And that's the final heat. So we're just allowing the piece to cool down a little bit now. We're about to put this into one of the annealing kilns, and that will control the cooling of the piece down to room temperature. This will take about 48 hours to cool down. The annealing temperature starts at about 510 degrees, and will actually hold all of the work throughout the day at 510, and then it cools down to 400 degrees centigrade between 24 and 36 hours, and then it can progress a little bit faster down to room temperature from there on. And that's just to remove the stress from the glass. As it's cooled from a liquid to a solid, there's a lot of inherent stress in the clear glass, but also between the layers of all the colours. So this cooling phase is a critical part of the process as it removes all of that stress and strain within the piece.